Gaza has faded from the headlines. Palestinians feel forgotten.
It feels like time is standing still. They don't know what to expect and when to expect it.
I'm Marco Werman. An update on Gaza and how some countries in the EU want to cut ties with Israel. Its leader responds.
Europe is losing control over its identity, over its values, over its commitment to safeguard civilization against barbarism.
Also today, the most successful woman you've likely never heard of.
Hatshepsut, if she'd been a male king, would be talked of as one of the greatest kings of pharaonic times.
And women musicians reveal the unsung female composers of the Renaissance.
What is amazing is that we're sort of able to explore this world, which was a very secret world.
That's all coming up today on The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. It is good to have you here this Monday. Gaza has faded from the headlines in recent weeks, yet more than 6 months after a ceasefire was announced there, violence continues to flare up. Hundreds of thousands of Gazans are living in tents, as well as in and around the bombed-out buildings that were once their homes. In Gaza City, Salma Al-Tawil of the Norwegian Refugee Council says now there are things she's never experienced before.
For example, I wake up at night to the sound of rats digging under the ruins of a building next to me, and I constantly feel they may enter my apartment.
Serious reconstruction has yet to begin in Gaza. The cost of rebuilding the infrastructure alone is estimated at more than $71 billion. That's according to a new report released today by the United Nations and the European Union. Residents of Deir al-Balah, the city in central Gaza, are doing their best to hang on. That includes Faten Tarawa.
No one can feel safe in Gaza, even if it is a ceasefire. Till there is airstrike, I don't know when my children will go to school. I don't know if I can offer them a good meal tomorrow or not. If the market will still operate for another couple of weeks or not. We don't know.
To learn more about the situation on the ground, we reached out to Sean Carroll. He's the president of ANERA, the American Near East Refugee Aid, a relief organization with deep roots in Gaza. He joined us earlier today from Washington to explain where things stand.
In the first 3 weeks after the war in Iran started, aid almost dried up completely. And now it's picked up again, but there's still not enough coming in. And of course, it's now more than 6 months since the October 10th ceasefire, and people are still dying, being killed, being injured each day. 3 or 4 people on average a day are killed, and more than 10 a day are injured.
So what then does ceasefire actually mean in practice for civilians in Gaza and aid groups like yours?
Well, obviously people are happy that there's a ceasefire and that the level of destruction and killing is not what it was before that, and some sense of normality has returned. But with conditions, so much destruction, conditions so difficult, and no political solution on the horizon.
We have seen this inconsistency of how the multi-phase ceasefire has been implemented. After the initial truce in phase 1, the next phase was supposed to bring withdrawal of military forces and the start of interim governance arrangements. Is that happening?
It's not happening, and that's what people are waiting for. But because it feels like time is standing still, they don't know what to expect and when to expect it. I think there is a sense that there's possibility on the horizon. The National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, part of the Board of Peace structure, is made up of well-known, competent, experienced Palestinian leaders and policymakers and aid groups like ANERA, who normally want to do long-term human development work. We're continuing to do only emergency response, and we want to move like everyone in Gaza does, want to move to recovery and reconstruction. And so we all know what needs to happen. As one of my staff said today, the solutions actually are not that difficult. People know what they need and they know how to make it happen. And they're frustrated that the world has looked away. Gaza's out of the headlines, it's out of people's minds, and it can't be because the situation continues, and it's worse. As summer comes, the sewage, the pests, there are rats, there are insects, there are more skin diseases, and people are worried. And more than half the population are still living in tents, and they've got raw sewage running outside those tents, and and they're crowded inside the tents. And when they come out for a breath of fresh air, they're not getting a breath of fresh air. They're getting the smell of sewage, and they're seeing insects and rats. And it's a very, very bad situation.
Yeah, pretty miserable. Still on the political front, when it comes to Hamas, there are conflicting reports. Some suggest Hamas is willing to give up some weapons. Also, they're working to reassert control on the ground, collecting taxes, increasing checkpoints, trying to provide some services. What are you hearing about their activities right now?
Well, it's tough for me to say. We have a no contact policy with Hamas. We've had it since they've come into Gaza. So before October 7th, we did our work separate from Hamas and continue to do that. But it's part of the uncertainty. People are uncertain. If you gave the option to go back to the way things were before October 7th, they would gladly take that, because however they felt about politics, mostly people had a chance at a normal life, and people were farming, and they were going to school, and they were going to work in hospitals, and they were going to receive reasonable care in hospitals. And that's one of the things the world didn't really know, that in many aspects, all intents and purposes, if you visited Gaza and you looked around, you thought, boy, people are really just trying to make a go of it. And that's what they want to get back to now.
Gaza is a territory about 140 square miles. That's about the size of Philadelphia. Before October 7th, the population was spread across Gaza. That is very different today. Where are most Gazans living now? Can you sketch us a map for us?
It's very different. I mean, Israel now occupies more than 50% of the Gaza Strip, and so population is concentrated in Gaza City and in the middle area, in Deir al-Balah and al-Mawasi. And Deir al-Balah, the middle area, was less populated before, but now that's probably tripled in population, and Gaza City has about doubled. So population that was spread across 5 governorates, including the north up above Gaza City, and Rafah down at the bottom, which are both completely closed off now and devoid of almost all population. All of those populations are in the middle area in Gaza City. So people can move around without as much fear of bombs falling on them as they had 6 months ago. But it's crowded, fuel is expensive, so getting around is difficult. And sometimes people end up, even though they can get a ride from someone who's got some fuel, they end up walking because it'd just be faster.
And why these particular areas? Is that Israel's doing, or is it where the remaining services for Palestinians exist?
Well, the middle area was the least damaged, and there are still, it will shock people when international press are finally allowed in. When people go in, they'll be shocked that there are some buildings and some streets and some neighborhoods that are intact. But for a while during the war, I think people hoped that it would stay a larger percentage, and now it's really a tiny percentage. But the middle area was less hit, and there's still some space. It was much more agriculture and green space before the war. A lot of that's gone, but there's still more than there is in Gaza City. But Gaza City, those are the 2 areas that are not occupied. The yellow line that cuts Gaza in half, it really is a kind of a backward C at the northern top. The eastern side and the southern side are all occupied by Israel, and people have been pushed into the center.
I'm catching up on the latest news from Gaza with Sean Carroll, the head of the relief organization American Near East Refugee Aid, which has long served people in Gaza. Sean, more than 2 years of a massive bombing campaign has been terrifying, especially for children. How is the mental health crisis showing up in the work of NARA?
Well, everyone, vast majority of people are suffering mental health issues, and certainly all of the children are. And I think it's not showing up fully yet because people are just trying to literally survive physically. And so, but we've had psychosocial support programming from the beginning. And what we've provided is only the beginning of the need. In other words, there needs to be real professional, widespread. It will need to be a part of any activity of recovery and reconstruction and long-term sustainable development will have to have elements of mental health provisions because everyone is traumatized. It doesn't take a lot for there to be some hope and for Palestinians in Gaza to grab it and to start to clear out the rubble from their home and rebuild and get back to school and get back to work. But the opportunities that are being provided and the aid that's coming in is just too little.
Of course, going to school is an important mental adjustment for normalcy for kids. We managed to connect with Salma Altawil in Gaza City today. She's a support manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council. And I want us to hear this because she sees signs of the determination of young people to get an education despite the destruction and sadness around them. Let's hear this.
Every day on my way to work, I see children carrying their school bags and walking through destruction. Despite the weak education system, they are learning in tents, not in schools. And despite the uncertainty of the future, they give me hope. They remind me that we deserve life and we deserve a better tomorrow.
Salma Altawil there, a resident of Gaza City and a support manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Sean, the latest UN-EU World Bank assessment estimates over $70 billion would be needed for reconstruction in Gaza. Can you imagine when kids would be able to go to school in a school building again?
I can imagine it because we've built schools throughout Gaza, throughout the West Bank. And all of us invest in education around the world, but for Palestinians, it's always been something absolutely cherished and dear and the way to imagine a better future and to keep going. And so that's exactly right. That image of little kids in Gaza going clean despite the hygiene difficulties. And they will do whatever they can to have education, to provide education. Our job is to provide that and to recognize where we see it without romanticizing it.
Sean Carroll heads up ANERA, American Near East Refugee Aid, a relief organization with deep roots in Gaza. He joined the show from Washington. Thank you very much, Sean, for all of this.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you for having me.
Libraries don't just lend out books. Some libraries lend out things like a sewing machine, a telescope, or even a leaf blower. Up until recently in Denmark, there was a lending library where you could check out actual people, offered up for the purpose of learning through conversation about their lives. Back in the fall, the world's Joshua Coe set out in Copenhagen to learn more.
A few Sundays ago, I was at a library in Copenhagen. Unlike most libraries, the librarian here doesn't shush you. In fact, she wants to get people talking.
Were you flirting with him?
Oh, clearly.
That's because it's a human library where visitors take out people who volunteer to be open books. Here, you can chat outside with your book in the library's reading garden. At the reference desk, librarian Sif Jensen shows me a chalkboard with today's book options.
So these are all the topics that we have on the shelf today, as we say. If you see a little green mark next to them, that means that they are in conversation. They're out doing a reading right now, so those are non-available.
The books on the board include a wheelchair user and a gay parent. There's also somebody who gave up a child for adoption and another who was subjected to incest. Jensen says the book titled Transgender is a great first read. So a few minutes later, I meet my book.
Hi.
This is Rachel.
Hi, Rachel. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Where should we sit?
Somewhere with a bit of shade from the rain.
Rachel Dover is a 58-year-old trans woman from Glasgow in Scotland.
What we're here to do as books is to answer questions about our lived experience. So I like to say at the beginning of every reading that I do that I am a literal open book. I will answer any and all questions, and I'm not going to get offended. My whole job as a book is to not be offended. I am here to assume that the questions are coming from a good place, and it doesn't matter how they're expressed. The language doesn't matter. I'll answer them.
Dover also offers her perspective as a Jewish person, and in her 5 years as an open book, she says that there's only ever been one question that she couldn't answer.
And her question was, what gives you the right to blow up all those Palestinians? And it was such a ragingly anti-Semitic question. It triggered me good and proper. And I didn't quite know how to handle it. That's the only time I've truly been shocked by a question. If I'm asked that question again, and I have been in different ways, I reflect it back and say, well, I'm Jewish, but I've explained in my introduction that I'm British, not Israeli. why are you trying to hold me responsible for what a foreign government does simply because I share some of the traditions and ethnicity?
Even if confrontational at times, Dover wishes more people could have conversations like the ones she's had at the Human Library.
You're welcome to have your agenda, but if you really want to learn from other people, you have to create an atmosphere where everyone can be honest and have space to make their mistakes and say things the wrong way and not pick holes in every single intonation and phrase in what someone is saying.
I will do a brief introduction to my story. There is a lot there, but then I will give the other chapters you can open if you wish, and it's up to you.
Tom Fadden's book title is Wheelchair User.
So, the beginnings of my story, at the age of 2, I was given a diagnosis of cerebral palsy. That's caused by lack of oxygen to the brain shortly after or during birth.
Fadden says that he'll answer just about any question a reader asks. But there's one question that did test his limits as an open book.
Essentially a question around, should my parents, if they knew I was disabled, should they have done something? So should I have been aborted? And that was probably the most challenging question I had, because I was like, oh, he's asking whether I should be here or not.
Fadden makes clear he thinks that question was well-intentioned, even if hurtful. He says that being a book can be just as insightful for him as it is for his readers.
Outside the library, it's made me want to understand situations more. So I hope it's made me a little bit more patient, a little bit more curious, and a little bit more understanding. I can't say I fully unjudged everyone, because we're always challenged on that, but I'm a work in progress.
And that was the idea when Ronnie Abergel founded the first human library here in Copenhagen 25 years ago. He says that he wanted people to unjudge each other, to challenge their assumptions. Today, his nonprofit, the Human Library Organization, has chapters or publishing partners in over 85 countries, including Australia, Japan, and the US.
Maybe there's less to be afraid of once we get talking to people, so sometimes it just might seem better to actually meet somebody who is trans or policeman or sex worker before you make up your mind about them.
Abergel says that he was inspired by his own experience. Growing up in Denmark with a mixed half-Danish, half-Moroccan background, he would frequently get asked questions about where he came from.
But I'm just as Scandinavian as they are, and I grew up here, and it's my country. I speak Danish, and I am part of the Danish culture. So I came up with the idea because I thought there are too many conversations it seems we can't have.
But Abergel is worried about the future of these conversations. The reading garden where we met here in Denmark is closing indefinitely.
Because we live in polarizing times, which means there isn't the same support for the type of work that we do that there was in the past.
While the Human Library is a nonprofit, only about 3% of its funding comes from donor support. Abergel tells me that the organization's mission to help improve understanding between different groups and communities translated well into diversity, equity, and inclusion training. For the longest time, U.S. companies made up the single biggest group of corporate partners for the Human Library. But Abergel says that since Donald Trump turned his rhetoric against DEI initiatives, those 200-plus corporate partners have dwindled.
And our country will be woke no longer.
Well, Abergel says he doesn't have the resources right now to keep the reading garden open. The Human Library will continue with its pop-up events at schools, at festivals, or wherever they're still welcome. For The World, I'm Joshua Coe, Copenhagen, Denmark.
And they're off. That was not the Boston Marathon, which took place today. It was won in 2 hours, 1 minute, and 52 seconds. The starting horn you just heard was the beginning of the Beijing half marathon yesterday. The first place finisher clocking in at 50 minutes, 26 seconds. Too many numbers? Well, let's just say that winning time was a good bit faster in running time than the world record. And the winner didn't even break a sweat. That's Du Xiaodi, one of the engineers who created the humanoid robot that won the race. Du says the robot was modeled on outstanding human athletes and how their legs move. Yeah, except human athletes don't have the same powerful liquid cooling system. The robot, built by a cell phone company called Honor, more than halved last year's robot record. One of the spectators at the race, Sun Jagang, says he can't wait to see what comes next. This is the first time robots have surpassed humans, which I never imagined, Sun says. I'm very excited for the future. If you're not getting Terminator vibes from this news, maybe you should. China is competing hard with the U.S. on technology, and this robot race is one way to show it off. U.S. officials have said autonomous robots like the ones at the race could, at some point, pose a national security threat. You're with the world. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. There have been rumblings for a while, but now several European countries are making it official. Over the weekend, Ireland, Slovenia, and Spain demanded that the EU cut ties with Israel. They cited Israel's new death penalty law for Palestinians convicted of terrorism and the government's support for violent Israeli settlers in the Palestinian West Bank, among other things. This is not new, but as the world's Jerry Haddon reports from Barcelona, anger toward the Israeli government appears to be growing.
Spain, Ireland, and Slovenia sent their demand to the European Commission in Brussels on Saturday. It's time to end the European Union Association Agreement with Israel, they said. In other words, to sever diplomatic and trade ties. The demand was in writing. This weekend, Sanchez put voice to it.
Y aquel gobierno que viola el derecho internacional y por tanto viola.
Any government that violates human rights and therefore the values of the EU, Sanchez said, cannot be a partner of the EU. It's that simple. Sanchez used a brand new pulpit to deliver that message to the world, the first ever Global Progressives Mobilization Summit, an event he hosted in Barcelona. Invited were thousands of Socialist Party reps, left-leaning NGOs, and world leaders, including Colombia's President Gustavo Petro, Mexico's Claudia Sheinbaum, and Brazil's Ignacio Lula da Silva. Here's Lula speaking through an interpreter.
No president of any country in the world, no matter how powerful, has the right to impose rules on other countries. We cannot wake up every morning and go to sleep every night with the president's Twitter account threatening the world, making war.
Without naming names, Lula was taking a shot at U.S. President Donald Trump, a close ally of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The progressives' larger goal to stop recent advances by the far right in the U.S., Latin America, and Europe. The mood at the summit was upbeat after the historic elections in Hungary just days earlier saw the defeat of far-right Prime Minister Viktor Orban. By playing host in Barcelona, Sanchez was positioning himself as the global progressive movement's new leader. His supporters say he's earned it for speaking out early and strongly against the wars in Iran, Lebanon, and Gaza.
Y que establezca la prohibición legal y permanente.
This was Sanchez in 2025 announcing an arms embargo on Israel, this after accusing Israel of genocide for its killing of Palestinians in Gaza in response to the October 2023 Hamas massacre in Israel. Israel's foreign minister, Gideon Sa'ar, then accused Spain of anti-Semitism, and France as well.
If they are so enthusiastic to establish a Palestinian state, they have huge territories, Spain and France. They can do that.
Europeans have, in recent months, begun to sour on Israel's government, says Beth Oppenheim. She's a Middle East and North Africa fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She says the Israeli-American war on Iran has infuriated and alienated Brussels, which was caught by surprise. But she says the problem runs deeper than this current conflict.
I think that for a long time, this sense of shared ideological affinity between Israel and Europe, that's been a significant part of, I think, the European and Israeli relationship, this kind of ideological affinity, liberal, democratic, shared values.
The conservative government of Benjamin Netanyahu, she says, has undermined this affinity in war, but also in words.
Europe, which swore after the World War to defend what is good, is today afflicted by a profound moral weakness.
This was Netanyahu last week on Holocaust Memorial Day, criticizing the EU.
Europe is losing control over its identity, over its values, over its commitment to safeguard civilization against barbarism, but this eternal commitment Israel does not forget.
Beth Oppenheim says rhetoric like this is straining ties with the EU, a bloc she points out that is Israel's largest trading partner. Europe has leverage to apply against the Israeli government, she says. Tomorrow, EU foreign ministers meet. They'll vote on whether to sanction violent Israeli settlers in the West Bank. That's one move among many that Spain's Pedro Sanchez has been pushing for. For The World, I'm Jerry Haddon, Barcelona.
Just how long is the English coastline? The question is prompted by the launch of a new national hiking path that hugs the English shore. As to its length, it turns out the answer to that is actually very squishy. Some estimates say it's just under 8,000 miles. Others calculate over 12,000 miles. There are similar discrepancies for most coastlines around the world. It's because of this thing called the coastal paradox. Geographer Catherine Samler is an expert in that paradox. She started by describing the coastal environment.
It's a really complex terrain, and there's all sorts of inlets and jagged rocks and sandy stretches that, like, where you actually decide to take a measurement really matters. And that's going to determine partially what the length is that you get. I looked at New Zealand's coastline before, and they have multiple different kind of coastlines depending on which official you might ask. So the New Zealand Department of Conservation says 15,000 kilometers, but others say it's less than 14,000. So this idea of a coastline paradox means that the length of a country's coastline depends on the length of the ruler used.
So you're talking about rulers. How do cartographers actually measure a coastline?
Well, I think there are a lot of different ways that cartographers will go out and make that measurement. But if they want to find out a nation's coastline, that there's kind of some international standards that are based on nautical charts. And this is kind of after decades of negotiation, determining what scale to take that measurement at. And that's because, of course, national borders are built on coastlines, and that kind of determines what different resources coastal nations have access to.
I mean, it sounds existential, frankly. I mean, are you saying there is not an international standard for measuring coastlines?
I'm saying there's an approximation that people have agreed upon based on kind of the average scale of a nautical chart. But I think it is actually existential as well. And there's a French mathematician who originally defined this kind of tricky idea of the coastal paradox. Is a French mathematician named Benoit Mandelbrot. And he's really poetic in saying that the coastline length is very elusive and that it's so ill-determined it can best be considered infinite. And I think that's a really good reminder about kind of our complex relationship with the natural world, and that it's always something that's a social and political relationship.
And when did that Frenchman discover this coastal paradox, or name it?
Yeah, he's writing about it in the 1980s, so really not that long ago. And actually, That's during these decades of negotiation for the United Nations Law, the Sea Treaty, which really set the standard.
So what are some of the other rulers or gauges by which we are able to measure coastlines?
I mean, I think that a lot of people are just kind of drawing a boundary based on, something that looks like a Google map. So something that's pretty zoomed out. Perhaps at like a satellite scale, you can start to take images of a coastline. But if you're walking the coastline and using survey equipment, you're going to get a lot more of the kind of complexity of the little inlets and outcroppings. And so it's just making that choice of, do we want to just cut a straight line, or do we want to measure into each kind of sinuous bay and capture that? And so as you zoom in, that coastline gets longer and longer.
You kind of were nodding to this earlier, Catherine, but this must have a huge influence on geopolitical relationships. Like, we know about land grabs and annexation of territories by one country from another, but have we seen conflict break out because of disagreements about where that coastline is?
Yes. I mean, I think there's been a lot of disagreement about where the coasts and the lines of national boundaries should be drawn in different parts of the South China Sea, say, for example, which also has other complexities of which rocks count as islands. So you could have a whole nother segment on what is an island or not an island.
Or islands that are created whole cloth out of nothing.
Indeed. And I think for geopolitics, it's been really difficult for countries to agree because the stakes are really large. for ocean resources and coastal communities. It's, of course, becoming more challenging with sea level rise where, coastline isn't static. You can measure it day to day and get different measurements because the coast is always moving and shifting. And sea level rise means that we're seeing a lot more changes that are kind of undermining the justifications for political borders at the coast. And so there's going to be a lot more disagreements about whose territory belongs to whom, especially for many low-lying nations and Pacific islands who are really concerned that their offshore fishing rights might disappear as a kind of international agreed-upon boundary erodes and becomes submerged.
I mean, even without climate change, there is tide change, which can be radically different in some parts of the world. If you think of the Bay of Fundy between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, what does all this mean for our understanding of the coastline as we go into the future?
Well, I think it's something that people need to negotiate and agree upon. That I think, coastal communities are on the front lines right now as we see, Black Sand Beach that's famous in Iceland was just washed away a few weeks ago. There was, several Alaska Native communities, many of the homes of their villages washed away last fall. There's very material impacts from sea level rise, but there's also political impacts that potentially can be negotiated away to kind of at least resolve some of these issues so that we can focus on these real material changes that are impacting people's lives. And so there's been several international law committee meetings about how to talk about and agree on national borders that are being changed to kind of reduce the risk of geopolitical disagreements.
Catherine Samler is an independent scholar and political geographer. We reached her in Spain. Hatshepsut is not a name you hear often, or ever, even though as pharaoh of Egypt for 22 years, she was one of the most powerful women in antiquity. But she was purposely and methodically erased from history. There are lots of theories about why. Recent research is adding another piece to the puzzle. Sarah Birnbaum reports.
If you could meet one person from history, who would it be? For Egyptologist Campbell Price at the University of Manchester, that's a no-brainer.
Absolutely. Hatshepsut.
The female king of Egypt some 3,500 years ago.
Hatshepsut, if she'd been a male king, would be talked of as one of the greatest kings of pharaonic times because she builds a huge amount. She dispatches significant trading expeditions beyond Egypt's borders. She must have a hand in with the military as well, although that often gets forgotten. So she's an all-rounder.
Hatshepsut is the daughter of the pharaoh Thutmose I. When he dies, she marries her half-brother, do not judge, Thutmose II. And when he dies, her stepson, Thutmose III, becomes pharaoh. Only he's like 2 years old. So Hatshepsut steps in to govern the country just until he comes of age, presumably. And then she's supposed to step back into the shadows. But she doesn't step back.
Hatshepsut just goes for it at some point, maybe significantly when Thutmose III is maybe coming of age and getting a mind of his own. She says, no, guess what? I'm going to be the pharaoh with you.
Technically, she's a co-pharaoh. Thutmose III is still in the picture, but Hatshepsut is running the show. And to prove it, she has carved reliefs and statues of herself put everywhere. Hatshepsut dies in 1457 BC. We think of natural causes. Then, 20 years later, Thutmose III, who is now on the throne by himself, he has her statues destroyed and her likeness hacked off temple walls. He tries to edit her out of history. Fast forward to the 1920s, American archaeologists find 2 pits near the temple complex at Deir el-Bahri, Egypt, and they're filled with thousands of fragments of statues of Hatshepsut. It looks like a crime scene to them, and they figure Thutmose III must have been so angry at his stepmom for stealing the throne that he wanted every image of her smashed to bits.
When I first looked at these pictures of these fragmented statues, I would tend to agree with the early archaeologists that this was kind of an emotionally fueled attack.
Jun Wang is a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto.
But my research actually suggests that it's more nuanced than that.
For his PhD, Wang is researching every fragment to figure out where it was found, how it was damaged, and why. His findings were recently published in the journal Antiquity. Wang concludes that Thutmose III did cut down statues of Hatshepsut, but he did it in a super specific way.
They were broken across the neck and the waist and the feet, but that's pretty much all the damage that they've sustained.
So what's going on? Statue foot fetish? Maybe, but no. Wang thinks Thutmose III probably wanted to take credit for all the impressive stuff Hatshepsut did during their joint reign, so he had her statues, quote, ritually deactivated. In ancient Egypt, statues were alive. They're the vessel for the ka, or spirit of the deceased person.
When they were first fashioned or completed, the statues would be subjected to a ceremony called the opening of the mouth, where essentially it's given the breath of life. And it's almost viewed as, a living entity. So when statues have to be disposed of, this inherent power has to be neutralized.
Wang says Thutmose had this done with care and premeditation, not at all like a man in the throes of anger.
I think Wang's work is incredibly useful in that he systematically goes through every statue.
Kara Cooney is an Egyptologist at UCLA. Her book about Hatshepsut is called The Woman Who Would Be King.
Where I have a problem is when he then says, the way the statues were destroyed means that it wasn't personal, that it wasn't filled with rage and anger. We don't know any of those things.
Cooney thinks Thutmose had a dynastic reason for doing what he did. He starts destroying the reliefs and statuary right around the time he's grooming his chosen son to be the next pharaoh, a son who isn't connected to Hatshepsut by blood.
And Hatshepsut's presence haunting the temples, her statuary all around, would have made the Egyptian elites look and think about who had not been picked as the next king. And I think for that reason, they had to remove her.
And then there's just the larger patriarchal discussion, Cooney says. If Hatshepsut were allowed to stay, then any royal wife or ambitious sister or powerful aunt could point to her example and say, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt, so can I. Best to just expunge her, Cooney says.
Patriarchs don't like women sneaking into their business, and to remove them is expedient.
Cooney says this gets to a central paradox about women and power. If Hatshepsut were like Cleopatra, who lost her kingdom and died by suicide, we'd all be talking about her. She'd be the subject of dozens of biopics. But Hatshepsut had the misfortune of being one of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world. And for that, Cooney says, she languishes in relative obscurity. For The World, I'm Sarah Birnbaum.
The World is produced by GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris studio in Boston and from the Department of Communication at UC San Diego. Find us online anytime at theworld.org. I'm Marco Werman. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.
The World is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the Lumina Foundation, committed to a fair, universal system for learning beyond high school that offers every American the chance for a better life. LuminaFoundation.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Renee Vacchio Albi, Roman Mars, the Kelson Foundation, and the Ken and Lucy Lehman family. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.